Economic sanctions are often described as a modern, bloodless alternative to war, but history tells a far more complex and unsettling story. Sanctions are not merely policy instruments drafted in ministries and announced at press conferences. They are weapons forged from trade finance and dependency, designed to reshape behavior by constricting the flow of economic life itself. When I look at sanctions through the long lens of financial history, I do not see diplomacy refined. I see power translated into pressure and pressure into suffering that rarely falls where it is officially intended. Sanctions reveal with uncomfortable clarity how deeply economic systems are entangled with sovereignty, survival, and control. The logic of sanctions is ancient. Long before the term existed, societies understood that denying access to markets could be as devastating as denying access to territory. In classical Greece, Athens used trade embargoes to weaken rival city-states, most famously against Megara, cutting it off from Athenian ports and markets. Thucydides noted that this economic pressure contributed to the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, an early reminder that sanctions rarely remain contained. Economic coercion tends to escalate because it attacks not armies, but livelihoods, and those under pressure respond politically, not passively. In the medieval world, sanctions took the form of trade interdictions enforced by empires and religious authorities. The Catholic Church wielded economic exclusion alongside spiritual excommunication, severing rulers from trade networks as punishment for defiance. City-states like Venice and Genoa used blockades to discipline rivals, understanding that commerce was the lifeblood of urban economies. These early sanctions were blunt, localized, and deeply personal. They worked best where trade routes were concentrated and alternatives scarce. Already the pattern was visible. Sanctions are most effective when dependency is high and options limited. The rise of global trade and finance transformed sanctions from regional tools into instruments of systemic power. By the 19th century, Britain's naval dominance allowed it to enforce blockades that crippled economies far beyond its shores. The Napoleonic Wars were as much contests of economic strangulation as of battlefield maneuver. Napoleon's continental system sought to exclude British goods from Europe, while Britain responded by controlling sea lanes and finance. Both sides learned a costly lesson. Sanctions inflict damage, but rarely in isolation. They distort entire economic systems, punish civilians, and create incentives for smuggling substitution and resistance rather than compliance. The 20th century marked the formalization of sanctions as a tool of international governance. After World War I, the League of Nations promoted sanctions as a collective means of enforcing peace without war. The idea was seductive. Unified economic pressure would deter aggression. Reality proved harsher. Sanctions against Italy, after its invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, were partial and uneven, signaling weakness rather than resolve. They failed to stop aggression and instead highlighted the difficulty of aligning economic interests across nations. The lesson was sobering: sanctions require unity to succeed, and unity is rare when costs are unevenly distributed. After World War II, sanctions became embedded in the architecture of global order, particularly under the United Nations, and later through unilateral actions by dominant powers. The Cold War reframed sanctions as ideological containment. The United States used trade restrictions, export controls, and financial isolation to constrain the Soviet bloc, while the Eastern Bloc responded with its own systems of autarky and internal trade. Sanctions here functioned less as tools of immediate change and more as instruments of long-term pressure, shaping development paths, technological gaps, and political narratives over decades rather than years. What truly transformed sanctions into a central geopolitical weapon was the rise of financial globalization. As capital markets integrated and the US dollar became the backbone of international finance. Access to payment systems, banking networks, and reserve currencies emerged as points of leverage more powerful than tariffs or blockades. Sanctions could now be targeted not just at goods, but at money itself. Freezing assets, restricting dollar transactions, and cutting institutions off from global clearing systems allowed states to project power across borders without moving troops. This was economic warfare conducted at the speed of accounting. Yet history warns us that the effectiveness of sanctions is deeply conditional. Sanctions work best when objectives are narrow, coalitions are broad, and the target lacks alternatives. They falter when demands are existential, when enforcement is fragmented, or when sanctioned states can redirect, trade, cultivate substitutes, or mobilize nationalism. Often sanctions strengthen the very regimes they aim to weaken by externalizing blame and consolidating internal control. The population bears hardship, elites adapt. This outcome is not accidental, it is structural. Perhaps the most enduring misconception about sanctions is that they are precise. In practice, they are blunt. They disrupt supply chains, inflate prices, degrade public services, and erode long-term development. Even smart sanctions aimed at individuals operate within systems that cannot easily isolate pain. History shows that economic pressure seeps outward, touching those with the least capacity to absorb it. Sanctions do not eliminate violence. They redistribute it into slower, quieter forms. At the same time, sanctions reveal a deeper shift in how power is exercised. They signal a world where influence flows through networks rather than borders, where control over finance technology and standards can outweigh control over territory. This makes sanctions attractive, but also dangerous. Overuse encourages fragmentation. States seek alternatives, parallel systems, and insulation from future pressure. Each sanction plants the seeds of its own erosion by motivating the creation of new pathways beyond its reach. And it is here at this tension between power and backlash that the modern story of economic sanctions becomes most relevant, because we are living in an era where sanctions are no longer exceptional, but routine, applied with increasing frequency in a world that is simultaneously more interconnected and more suspicious. And the question history presses upon us is not whether sanctions can hurt, but whether they can still shape outcomes in a system already adapting to their presence as economic coercion. Risks accelerating the very fragmentation it seeks to control, and the global order begins to shift toward a phase where sanctions no longer feel like temporary measures, but permanent features of geopolitical rivalry, and the story moves toward a world where economic coercion reshapes incentives as profoundly as markets once did, and where the long-term consequences of sanctions may matter more than their immediate impact. As sanctions become normalized, states no longer treat them as extraordinary responses to exceptional behavior, but as standing instruments of policy. This normalization changes behavior on both sides of the pressure. Those who impose sanctions grow more willing to reach for them, often underestimating cumulative effects, while those who endure them begin to reorganize entire economic systems around the assumption that exclusion is permanent rather than temporary. History shows that once sanctions cross this psychological threshold, adaptation accelerates. Sanctioned states invest in self-sufficiency, not out of ideology, but necessity. Domestic substitutes replace imports. Alternative payment systems emerge. Trade pivots toward partners willing to ignore or resist enforcement. These adjustments are costly and inefficient, but they create resilience against future pressure. Over time, the leverage of sanctions diminishes, not because they stop causing pain, but because pain is anticipated and priced into policy. What was once shocking becomes expected, and expectation dulls deterrence. This dynamic carries global consequences. Financial fragmentation increases as states seek insulation from foreign control. Currency blocks multiply. Reserve diversification accelerates. Technologies once shared openly become guarded behind national security rationales. The global economy, which grew powerful through integration, begins to sacrifice efficiency for autonomy. This is not deglobalization in a dramatic sense, but a slow thickening of borders around critical systems. History reminds us that such shifts rarely reverse quickly. Once parallel structures exist, they acquire constituencies that defend them. Sanctions also alter domestic politics in subtle ways. They reward regimes capable of controlling narratives and suppressing dissent, while punishing societies that depend on openness and pluralism. Economic hardship does not automatically translate into political change. More often, it hardens identities. The external enemy becomes a convenient explanation for internal failure. In this sense, sanctions can stabilize power structures they are meant to weaken. This outcome is not accidental. It reflects a misunderstanding of how societies respond to pressure. Fear rarely produces compliance. It produces adaptation and defiance. From the perspective of those imposing sanctions, another risk emerges: dependency on coercion itself. When sanctions become the default response, diplomacy atrophies. Incentives for negotiation weaken. Each new measure escalates expectations without guaranteeing results. History offers a sobering parallel in military overreach tools that seem effective early lose potency when overused, while costs accumulate quietly. Economic warfare, like any other, reshapes the battlefield in ways that outlast the conflict. And yet it would be wrong to conclude that sanctions are futile. They can constrain resources, signal norms, and impose real costs. They can slow aggression and limit capacity. Their power lies not in isolation, but in coordination, clarity, and restraint. History suggests that sanctions work best when they are part of a broader strategy that includes diplomacy, credible off-ramps, and realistic goals. When used as symbolic punishment or moral theater, they tend to disappoint. When used with precision and humility, they can influence outcomes at the margins where power is actually negotiable. The deeper lesson, however, is structural. Sanctions reveal how much modern power rests on networks rather than territory. Control over finance standards and access has become as consequential as control over land. This makes economic coercion tempting, but also destabilizing. Each use accelerates the search for alternatives. Each success plants the seed of future resistance. History teaches us that systems built on exclusion eventually provoke the creation of new systems outside their reach. As the world moves forward, economic sanctions will remain a central feature of geopolitical rivalry, not because they are perfect tools, but because they are the least violent option available in a highly interconnected world. The challenge is to remember what history makes. Plain sanctions are not neutral, not clean, and not easily reversed. They shape economies, politics, and alliances long after headlines fade. Used carelessly, they fragment the very order they aim to defend. Used wisely, they may buy time, but never certainty. If this exploration of economic sanctions has sharpened your understanding of power in the modern world, I invite you to subscribe and continue these journeys through financial history with me, and to leave a comment sharing whether you believe sanctions are losing effectiveness or merely entering a new phase. Because history reminds us that the tools nations rely on most often are the ones they understand least. And it is only by studying their past consequences that we can judge how they might reshape the future.